The results of the studies reported in empirical articles obviously contribute to our knowledge about the variables in the study. Understanding research design helps us understand that knowledge. That understanding also helps us use logical thinking to apply the results to related variables. When we think about what we can learn from what we read in an article, it's helpful to remember the difference between primary and secondary sources, along with what we know about APA style. One thing that creates confusion is that empirical articles are a combination of primary and secondary sources. The introduction section is primarily a secondary source, and parts of the discussion might be too. The variables, participants, procedure, and results are all primary source information, and authors frequently summarize their results in the discussion, which is primary source information. It can get complicated, though, because authors do combine ideas in the introduction and discussion sections in a way that makes an original point, a process sometimes referred to as synthesizing. The information about specific measures of the variables is also sometimes from other sources. The information both primary and secondary sources is helpful, but we're going to focus on applying what you're learning about research methods, so we'll be looking at the portion of the article that's a primary source. We've also already been working with strategies to make that easier. It's part of the reason I have you use the summary worksheet. We'll refer to 3 parts of the worksheet in thinking about what we know from each study: the variables, design, and summary of results. Note that I say the variables and not the operational definitions. The operational definitions are an important part of designing a study and help us interpret the meaning of the variable, but the author's emphasis is on the variable, and the measure is just a way to get to that. Plus, some of the information about the operational definition is often from another source. So far, I focused on the content of what we can say when. We also have to think about the different ways to say it, though, and how to give credit for the information, otherwise known as the sentence structure and citations. There are really countless ways we can structure our writing, so I'm making some really broad generalizations to give us a starting point. I hope those generalizations about structure also help clarify the difference between an in-text citation and a parenthetical citation. That said, one common approach to writing about the results of an article is what I call reporting, where the author states the who and the what. In this case, it's the authors and what they found. That structure would use an in-text citation format. As you might remember from the module on plagiarism, though, reporting is not a particularly strong form of writing. Summarizing is the next step. It still puts the main points in the author's own words and is focused on specific content, but structured in a way that doesn't refer directly to the authors and the findings. That structure uses a parenthetical citation. Summarizing is still pretty narrow in focus, though, and we don't need to be that narrow as long as we're accurate. That's where paraphrasing comes in. The ideas and information from the primary source can be presented in the author's own words and in a different form, with the parenthetical citation signaling that the ideas are based on the primary source. I'll explain a few more things we have to keep in mind, but before we get into those details, examples will probably be helpful. We've looked at the Burton and King article as we applied each of the concepts, so we can refer back to think about what we know based on a study. This slide summarizes the information we need from the article and gives an example of each approach to explaining what we know given that information. As you review these examples, note 2 things. First, even though the reporting structure uses the same words the article used to identify variables, it's not an exact phrase or sentence from the article, so it doesn't have to be in quotation marks. Second, both the summarizing and paraphrasing sentence use the phrase maybe. That signals to the reader that the ideas are in the author's own words and goes along with the fact that the findings are based on probability and so forth. When we're using the reporting structure, the knowledge we can gain is simply the results of the study. To write about that information accurately, we need to make sure the wording gives the correct impression about the design and the variables included in the study. For example, we know that Burton and King conducted an experiment where they manipulated writing, measured mood and health center visits, and found that writing about positive experiences was associated with enhanced positive mood and better health. It was an experiment, so it's accurate to use a structure that suggests cause and effect. But they didn't measure stress, so a sentence saying they found writing could reduce stress is not accurate. As you might have gathered, when we're using a parenthetical structure, we have a little bit more flexibility in what we can say. We can use various forms of logic, including inductive and deductive reasoning, to think about how the results add to our knowledge. This approach requires wording that's more tentative, though, because it's not directly supported by the results. That helps the reader know that the part of this idea is really ours, but it's supported by the findings from the study in the cited article. It's a good rule of thumb to focus on one part of the research design when making a logical extension. When we think this way, we're really speculating about how we think the results of the study relate to other variables or populations. But if we're speculating too much, we're really just coming up with ideas that aren't supported by the results. The structure of the sentence in this slide gives the impression that the study in the cited article measured stress, which we know isn't accurate. If we changed reduces to may reduce, though, it would signal that it was a speculation based on the findings of the article, and it'd be okay. The second article I've used in the examples, by Hurst, Baranik, and Daniel, is even more helpful for thinking about what we can say and can't say in different structures, given the design of the study. This was the study that compiled the results of other studies about sources of stress in college students to increase our understanding about sources of stress. The study included findings about several sources of stress, so we could accurately report on the results in a number of ways. The information in the top row of this slide is just one example. The paraphrase statement in the top row is an accurate paraphrase because the phrase may cause signaled that it's based on a logical extension of the findings, and the phrase day-to-day events is a way to categorize some of the sources of stress that the authors listed in Table 2 in the article. The study was not experimental, though, so it's not accurate to use reporting structure and say they found relationships caused an increase in stress. That statement is also not accurate because they did not look at studies that measured changes in stress, and the word increase implies there was a measure of change. The inaccurate example of paraphrasing uses maybe to signal it's not a direct summary of results, but the variable and the design represented in the sentence is not accurate. It suggests the findings include information about smoking, but they didn't, and that the study somehow compared students to determine which group had a higher level of stress, but it didn't. Now that you've seen a couple of examples, it might be helpful to pause the recording and practice thinking about reporting and paraphrasing what we know based on the findings from the study in the Schifrin and Nelson article. There's not one right answer when we think about what we know based on the results of the study. While we need to make sure our wording accurately represents the research design, even the reporting of the findings can vary because we can use different wording to explain the same thing. Your notes could be different than the example in this slide then. As long as they don't suggest causation, you're probably on the right track. The example of paraphrasing in this slide signals that it's a paraphrase by using may and only includes the variables that were included in the study. So it's accurate to refer to cause and effect relationship even though the study was not experimental. When we think about how the results of a study add to our understanding, we're thinking about knowledge from a primary source. That leads us to focus on particular parts of empirical articles. Then, thinking about the different ways we can write about the findings helps us think about what those findings mean. To accurately know what we know based on the findings, though, we need to apply our knowledge of research design and methods.